Good morning, Dan and Amy. Some news over the weekend. Some of our erstwhile enemies, Russia and North Korea, making news. One, Russia on the missile defense front. Yeah. Well, the ability to pierce our missile defenses.
A missile that could hit Florida. That's his direct shot to President Trump.
The avant-garde missiles. This is obviously didn't start in development when Trump was elected. This has been in the making for years. But the unveiling of the avant-garde missiles, and then North Korea, that little tin horn dictator, going back to, because apparently he forgot some of his Olympic swag in Pyeongchang.
No, yeah, his sister did. So he went back to Pyeongchang, and he's meeting with high-ranking South Korea delegation in Pyeongchang.
For more details on the implications of both of these developments in both of these countries, we're pleased to be joined by Cedric Leighton, CNN military analyst and security consultant who served on both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. Anytime.
So why don't we start with Russia and give us your kind of threat assessment on the as it pertains to the avant-garde missiles?
Well, these missiles are really hypersonic weapons, which means they can go a lot faster than any of the missiles that are currently in Russia's inventory. The other part of it is that they are, at least some of them, are supposedly nuclear engine powered, which means that they have unlimited range, at least in theory. So when that happens, if you create a system like that, it is basically designed to go after all of the missile defense systems that the United States and its allies have. And if that's the case, it would not only create a military problem for us, but it also creates a lot of violations of existing treaties, INF treaties, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and other treaties that are designed to cap weapons of this type. So what Putin is trying to do, whether or not these missiles actually work, is to sow fear in the West and to basically say, we've got weapons, don't attack us, don't do anything that makes difficulties for Russia as we move into areas like Ukraine and possibly other areas of Europe, and of course as they move into Syria and consolidate their hold on parts of Syria.
But will the U.S. be able to stop Russia's new arsenal of weapons?
So that's an interesting question, Amy. I think that the answer is we can't prevent them from developing these types of weapons unless there's a treaty that's put in place to specifically prohibit them. Mm-hmm. And then you have to be careful that that treaty not be violated. Short of physically attacking weapons as they're being developed or as they're being put into their bases or moved around, depending on the type of weapon, it would be very hard to actually interdict them. It can be done, but you need really good intelligence to do that. And as far as stopping them in mid-flight, that is, given current technology, practically impossible if they work as Putin has advertised.
All right, so from one nuclear threat to the other, let's go to North Korea. And what are we to make, if anything, of this perhaps thawing of relations between North and South Korea?
Well, this is very interesting. It kind of reminds me of the time in the 1970s when, at the time, West Germany did some dealings with the then Soviet Union. So, this could be, if we coordinated things correctly with the South Koreans, it could be kind of a carrot and stick approach. In this case, the South Koreans are providing carrots to the North. We stay in the background for at least a bit and provide the threat of a stick, if you could use that analogy. I think that in the case of the situation with North and South Korea, North Korea is feeling desperate. The sanctions are beginning to bite. They are feeling the need to go in and actually make some changes to not only their leadership, but also to the way they run things and how they get money, which is really the most important thing for them. Since they're feeling desperate, or at least some pressure, they are willing to talk. They are not going to give up their nuclear weapons program. They're not going to give up any nuclear weapons in spite of what the U.S. wants them to do. So we have to realize that they see this as part of the way that they can secure their sovereignty and their control over the northern part of Korea.
But do you think this could eventually lead to the North having talks with the U.S.?
I think it could. I think it's definitely possible. Certainly the U.S. has at times signaled that they're open to talks. Whether it's the president himself or Secretary Tillerson or some other members of the administration. I think that in this case, one strategy would be to let the South Koreans talk to the North as long as we're coordinating with the South Koreans and there's no real daylight between us. It could work, and then those talks between South Korea and North Korea could pave the way for talks between the U.S. and North Korea. We have to be careful, I believe, not to elevate the North Koreans to too high a status diplomatically and internationally, but we also have to realize that they do pose a danger not only to our forces that are stationed in South Korea, but also to the United States at large with the development of their intercontinental missile capabilities.
Trey Gowdy was on with Maria Bartiromo over the weekend talking about FISA abuses after the competing memos had been released, and he had this to say, listen.
Congress has proven itself incapable of investigating this FISA abuse. DOJ should not be looking into it. We need an independent arbiter that's either the Inspector General or Special Counsel.
And Gowdy went on to suggest that the Inspector General, Horowitz, who he trusts, the problem is that there are so many people that are no longer at justice, and so they're beyond his purview, thus probably the need for a second special counsel. You served on the Joint Chiefs. You served on the National Security Council. What's your take on the allegations of FISA abuse in the collusion case and Gowdy's suggestion that probably a second independent counsel is needed to investigate the alleged abuses?
Well, on the surface of it, you'd have to say that, if there is any question on how things were done, a special counsel or an inspector general, would certainly be a useful way to look at that. I think that, unfortunately, it's divided the country, those who look at the special counsel that is investigating Russian collusion with the Trump campaign and potentially the Trump administration. That is kind of a favorite of the Democratic side. And, of course, the Republicans tend to look at things like the FISA abuse and what Representative Gowdy talked about. I look at it this way. If there is any question, it should be investigated. When I look at the procedures that I know have been followed in the case of this alleged FISA abuses, I don't see real abuses in these situations. And the reason I say that is that there was enough suspicion in the case of Carter Page to warrant a look at what his activities were. It doesn't mean he's guilty, but what it does mean is, this is a person who, from a counterintelligence perspective, had really close relationships with a hostile foreign power.
He also had a close relationship with the FBI.
Well, and so that's something that, if that is the case, you have to look at, what was he doing and for whom? I mean, if he is a counterintelligence agent, or somebody in the employee of the FBI, either as an agent or, as another entity, then of course that becomes a completely different issue.
What about the failure to be fully transparent, though? The FBI's failure to be fully transparent with the FISA court with respect to the dossier, which really wasn't disputed by the Schiff
memo. The dossier is a very
memo.
interesting document, and when you look at what one side says, they say yes, it was paid for by opposition research. So what it sounds like happened in this particular case, and there are lots of reports on different aspects of this. But what it sounds like happened here is that they did say yes, it was paid for by a political entity. They may not have made it explicitly clear who that entity was, and I think that should have been done. I think it should be very clear that, in the case of the dossier, the original research or the initial research was paid for by Republican opposition research elements. The second part of it, of course, was paid by Democrats, and that should always be known by the courts. And, if there was a mistake made in that regard, then that, of course, should be corrected.
Yesterday, Lindsey Graham was on Face the Nation, hoping, telling I don't even know who the commentator was, that he hopes that John Kelly stays and H.R. McMaster stays on. But what do you think is H.R. McMaster's future? I mean, he soldiers on, but he seems like to be trapped between competing agendas.
Yeah, this is one of the real debates that people have about the position of National Security Advisor. Should there be a military person in that position, or should it be somebody with national security experience but who is not currently serving in the military? And we've used both models throughout the history of the position of the National Security Advisor. For General H.R. McMaster, you're right, he is going to soldier on, and that's what military people do. We do that, until we get other orders, and that is sometimes something that doesn't work very well when there are a lot of political agendas out there, because military people have their own kind of politics, but it's not the same kind that is practiced either in the West Wing of the White House or in the halls of Congress. So McMaster is going to, I think, it's inevitable that he's going to leave at some point. The stories circulating right now indicate that he will not continue on in the military, and that will be a big loss for the Army and for the nation. But he may end up working at a think tank. Stanford the Hoover Institution was one possibility that was talked about, and he certainly will contribute there. He is probably the foremost military intellectual currently serving in the U.S. military, and that is certainly a talent that the nation needs in whatever capacity he chooses to serve.
So the focus, of course, is Russian collusion. Yet over the weekend, the New York Times now raising the specter of UAE collusion. United Arab Emirates. George Nader, a Lebanese-American businessman who the New York Times describes as hovering on the fringes of international diplomacy for 30 years, back-channel negotiator with Syria during the Clinton administration, reinvented himself a couple of different times, including as an advisor in the United Arab Emirates. Frequent visitor to President Trump's White House. Questions that maybe Special Counselor Mueller is looking for answers to as it pertains to Nader and his interaction with Trump fundraisers for the purposes of funneling foreign money into the Trump campaign. Do you have any perspective on UAE collusion allegations?
Well, I've worked a bit in the Middle East, both in the military and in my post-military career, and that's certainly something worth looking into. And not that there's any indication at the moment, at least, that anybody did anything wrong on the Trump side of things. It's still important to know what these foreign governments are trying to do. And it's very clear, has been very clear for quite some time that the United Arab Emirates specifically has been seeking to influence U.S. policies, U.S. politics. They have a fairly strong lobbying arm here in Washington. They do a lot of different things. As far as I know, so far most of them legal and permitted by law, but there are a lot of shady characters that work in and around the Middle East, and there are plenty of opportunities to launder money, plenty of opportunities for countries like the UAE to serve as brokers between, let's say, Russia and the United States, as an example. And there are a lot of things that usually at least call some question into the way they are conducted. So, the special counsel, may very well find some things to look at. They may or may not implicate people in the Trump campaign or even in the administration, but it's very clear that the United Arab Emirates has sought to influence elections in the past, or at least the outcome of U.S. policy. And, the same can be said for some of the other nations in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and a few others. But what you see is an opportunity, I think, for the special counsel to look at different connections and determine whether or not they were proper.
He is Colonel Cedric Leighton, CNN military analyst and security consultant who served on both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Thanks so much. You guys have a great day.
You too.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.